Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
And I'm Adam, your co-host. And before we even get into tonight's conversation, Andy, we're recording this on the night of Sunday, July 21st, in the aftermath of the CrowdStrike failed software update 2 days prior on Friday, July 19th. Now, for longtime listeners of the show, you know Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We work in our field security sales. And CrowdStrike is a competitor to what we do. Microsoft makes Defender for Endpoints a competitive product to a lot of what CrowdStrike does. However, I would say we both have a ton of respect for CrowdStrike. They make a good product, issues notwithstanding. And certainly this is maybe the biggest story we've ever covered in the history of this show. Obviously a massive disruption on Friday and continuing into the weekend. And so before I go any farther, I just want to start off by sending my deepest empathy and sympathy to anyone working in technology or adjacent to technology that was impacted by this. I have been there. I worked a 20-hour straight shift trying to remediate an email outage that had taken down email for my entire company. I know what it feels like having people check in. Hey, are we up yet? Hey, what's going on? Hey, what's status? And the stress you feel and the obligation you feel and the lack of sleep and how it starts to impact your ability to think clearly. And a lot of people have put in a lot of sleepless hours on Friday and this weekend. And Andy and I both come from a corporate IT background, and we certainly send our thoughts to everyone who has been taken away from their family, their planned vacations, so many disruptions to human life over the last couple of days. So to start off with, I'm certainly thinking of you all and hope you are able to get up and running soon. The second point I want to make is, again, even though Andy and I work for Microsoft, this is not a Microsoft-funded show. This is not meant to reflect the opinion of Microsoft. This is Andy and I talking as Andy and Adam and nobody else. We're going to look at this from an academic perspective. So what happened? Why did it happen? What should security defenders know? Where do we go from here? And there will be a time for conversations around, should you look at competitive solutions? What are the challenges with them? What are the differences in approach to how different vendors look at it? I think it's fair to say CrowdStrike will lose some customers over this. However, this is not the time to discuss that. And we'll say I'm proud of my employer and Microsoft for how we've handled this and how we've leaned in to help customers. And we'll talk about this during the show, but as we record this on Sunday evening, earlier in the day, Microsoft shipped a automated patch that you can put on a USB drive and basically plug in machines and fix them from this issue if they're still stuck in that blue screen of death loop. So all of that is to say we are focused on getting folks up and running. We're focused on cybersecurity as a team sport. We're focused on the rising tide that lifts all ships. There will be a time in the future for conversations around pros and cons of different endpoint protection platforms. That day is not today, and that's not what we're here to do. We're here to inform and educate and talk about where we as an industry go from here. So with that, Andy, let's get into it. Let's talk about CrowdStrike and Friday.
Yeah. So we don't have to belabor the point because I'm sure if you have been following the news at all, everyone knows really what happened. So CrowdStrike pushed a bad content update to Windows hosts, causing it to go into a boot loop into what we call the blue screen of death, or BSOD. And CrowdStrike did publish some technical details. We'll have that link within the show notes, but essentially a summary of that is that they pushed out what they call a content update, called a channel file. And that's part of behavioral protection mechanisms used by the CrowdStrike Falcon sensor that is on the Windows machine. Updates to the channel files is normally part of that cadence and part of the sensor's operation. It occurs multiple times a day in response to different techniques and tactics and procedures that are discovered by CrowdStrike in the field. So whenever they see something that they're like, hey, we need to look for this type of behavior, let's update the channel files. It's not a new process. The architecture has been there since Falcon's inception. Unfortunately, this configuration update triggered a logic error that resulted in a system crash. And so that's the short of it. And the impact of it was fairly wide. And I'm not going to, belabor the point, but it is from, our point of view in technology, probably the largest crash in history and the most impactful that I've ever seen in my lifetime. I know that there have been several other ones that, as people have been posting on Twitter, there have been other ones, but just to walk through kind of like a timeline, this actually started late Thursday night, July 18th, and then really into the morning of Friday, July 19th. Several states experienced 911 outages between 2 and 3 a.m. early Friday morning. The FAA announced that all Delta and American Airlines flights were grounded, and then minutes later, they grounded United and Allegiant flights as well. A few hours later, at 5 to 6 a.m. on Friday, public transit systems began announcing that they have been impacted. Washington, D.C., all trains and buses began experiencing delays. In New York City, and this was interesting, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, which is the North America's largest transportation network, said the systems went temporarily offline, but train and bus services remain unaffected. New York has some of the most redundant and robust information systems. I think, partly probably because of like what they've experienced in the past, the terrorist attacks, 9/11, and all that other stuff. And so they went back to their redundant and fail-safe procedures and actually kept everything going despite having some blip in their systems early on due to this CrowdStrike thing. So, props to them having a very robust system. Then around 5:30 a.m., CrowdStrike tells all of its customers that they're aware of the crashes. 6 to 7 a.m., global banks start reporting some disruptions. The mayor of Portland issued an emergency declaration in response to the outage because it started affecting their communications computer-aided dispatch system, which is used to field emergency calls. So that was pretty impactful to the city of Portland, and the bureau started taking calls manually. Between 8 and 9 a.m., some flights started resuming, but airports were, of course, slammed at that point, and they were probably preparing for a pretty busy day. Between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m., the 911 operations centers became operational again. The dispatch system in Portland started coming back, and then President Biden and the executive branch was briefed on the CrowdStrike outage. And so this kept on going, hospitals, federal government buildings, all of that was continued throughout the entire day. It's really interesting because my wife works in medicine as well. And I told her about it before she went to work. And then when she got to work, she said all the computers were down. So I know in Madison, SSM Health and UW Health were affected by it. I asked my wife later when she came back, and she said the computers did return around noon. It was just kind of constant rebooting, and the patch apparently went through. That was like an unofficial method of recovering the systems.
Reboot 15 times. I heard that more than once.
And so, the impact to her was pretty big too. She had to go to paper notes. She was not able to access her electronic health records. So she had to write paper notes, she wasn't able to actually write any narcotic prescriptions. They use a specific program to do that. That was down all day. So, she was like, well, if it doesn't return, I'm going to have to start writing paper prescriptions, which again, like, when was the last time you went to a doctor and like they wrote on a piece of paper the prescription, then ripped it off and gave it to you to take to the pharmacy? So a lot of manual stuff. And, that was throughout the entire day, and again, continues on through this weekend. And so the biggest question that I think a lot of folks in technology have is really, how could this happen? How could this bad update get through Q&A or quality assurance and get pushed out to production without having been either tested, or maybe they pushed out the wrong file, which speaks to maybe a blip in their CI/CD pipeline and they accidentally pushed out the wrong file? Why did they have, the entire global system get pushed out all at once, and then it wasn't like a ringed deployment, like a staged rollout where you're just kind of rolling it out to a percentage of customers? And so, I think there's a lot of questions that CrowdStrike needs to answer, and they haven't really done any of that. They just have posted, we know that we did something wrong, and here's the fix for it. They haven't really given us a look behind the scenes of why this would happen. And I'm hoping that as they do some more investigation in this, that they will publish something that will explain this a little further. So anyways, I'll take a pause there. Adam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, great summary of all the impacts. It was hard to keep up with them all. So I kind of like hearing the timeline through that, even if I knew there were widespread impact. It is sobering again to hear how big the impact is. I think one thing that stood out to me, and I've been competing against CrowdStrike now for effectively 7 years. I did not realize what a security monoculture we had around CrowdStrike. I did not know, even competing against them, how dense their market share was. Because my understanding of their market share is it's something like 35 to 40%, but it sure didn't feel like that on Friday. It was truly astounding. And I think this speaks to the fact that this is, again, there'll be a time to do comparisons, but I think security would be better off if we had more diversity of endpoint protection platforms and we didn't have everyone playing follow the leader and on the same platform. Obviously, that could be a competitive advantage for your business if an event like this happens in the future and you happen to zig where everyone else zags. So again, more time to discuss that in the future. The QA questions are obviously going to be the biggest questions of all coming out of this, because my point I have made to anyone I've spoken to, and Andy, like you, I've had a lot of people come to me and say, hey, what happened? What's going on? I know you can explain it in simpler terms. I don't blame anyone for shipping bad code. Bad code happens. Bugs happen. Bugs will get pushed to production. That will happen. So the question becomes, if you assume, like we assume breach, if you assume bugs, then what is your defense in depth? Again, security terminology here. What's your defense in depth to prevent them from being broadly deployed? That is what I would consider incremental deployments, scope deployments, deployment rings. You talked about that, Andy. I think we need to have a serious conversation around, yes, we are trying to respond to threats as fast as possible, but the cure can't be worse than the disease. At this point, CrowdStrike took down more customers than cyber criminals ever have, right? So the cure is officially now worse than the disease in many ways. More business has been impacted, more productivity lost than cyber criminals have caused in the last 10 years combined. So at this point, the cure was worse than the disease. That can't happen again. So I think we all need to take a step back from the cliff and, as we move forward, have a frank discussion around what is a reasonable balance of speed of deploying behavioral updates, signature updates, whatever we're deploying, and balancing that against our ability to detect and prevent a bug like this from hitting 100% of field endpoints. That can't happen again. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, and I know everyone knows this. I know CrowdStrike knows this, but they need to be very radically transparent with us. And I will say this as well. And again, I don't think I'm saying anything anybody doesn't know. CrowdStrike has a history of assigning blame to others in scenarios. I'm trying to use very neutral language here, when things have gone wrong with other organizations. And so if you're going to make those claims against other organizations when the spotlight turns to you and it's your turn to perform, I think it's only a fair expectation, given how critical CrowdStrike has been of others, that they need to be radically transparent about what happened. And they have earned that through their behavior in the past. And I think anything short of radical transparency, you will get a disconnect between their public messaging and their criticism of others versus their own behavior. So those are things I want to see moving forward. But yeah, great summary so far. Let's keep going.
Something to keep in mind if you are a CrowdStrike customer is that cyber criminals immediately started taking advantage of the crisis. They registered several domains that were like CrowdStrikeDoomsday.com or CrowdStrikeDown.site, CrowdStrikeZeroDay.com. So there's a whole list of IOCs that CrowdStrike's intelligence team has published. You should go there and take a look and obviously monitor your environment for those, any type of traffic that might be coming from there, phishing emails that might be coming from there. And then, of course, like the intelligence team also monitored several types of phishing phone calls that were people who were trying to pose as either researchers or help desk to sell you some sort of automated recovery tool or pose as CrowdStrike support to help you through this. So Rachel Tobach posted some great advice on LinkedIn, and I won't go through the entire thing, but essentially, make sure that you're verifying the identity of people over the phone, on email, whoever it is. Make sure that they are who they say they are before taking any type of sensitive action. And she's got a great LinkedIn article that I will post in our show notes, kind of going through different exercises of both friends and family as well as in the corporate environment on how you can go about doing that. But we've had those discussions here where like help desk security and trying to verify before you reset a password, something like that, right? So in this crisis, cyber criminals are obviously going to try to take advantage of that as soon as possible, and they did. So really interesting. I read this article on Friday talking about the news around this CrowdStrike issue, and I wanted to see what your thoughts are, Adam, because I think it's a really good discussion. Security teams and CISOs have really tried throughout the years, probably in the last decade or so, to make sure that executives and board members know how important security is, that they're not just a cost center, that the controls that we're putting in place are not just something that we're doing for kicks. They're actually important. We want to get our solutions funded. Like even some of the most rudimentary controls like MFA were resisted for many, many years because it was something that caused friction that people didn't like. And so this whole crash, I think, is going to bring a lot of questions to security teams and CISOs from those board members and from those executives who want the company to make money. And when you're down and you can't make money, that's a problem. And it's a problem that's, a security tool that you bought that was supposed to keep the company safe didn't do that. It actually cost millions or billions or however, money it did. And so it really raises some questions about should we continue to fund security programs, and in this case, you're not a business enabler. You were definitely a cost center. So I think it's a good conversation to have. Like, how do you think security teams should respond to this type of criticism? That's something that they put in and instilled in the company, supposed to keep the company safe, actually did.
It's a huge problem. I'm a frequent flyer on Delta Airlines, so I follow them on all their social media channels. And I've watched over the weekend as they have posted day after day saying, hey, there's a travel waiver today. You can make changes for free. You can rebook for free. If you're disrupted, we will cover the cost of your meals and hotel, so on and so forth. Think of all of the travelers times all of those meals and all of those hotels that Delta Airlines is covering over the course of this weekend because of CrowdStrike. And then multiply that by how many businesses lost productivity. Andy, I think it's in the trillions. I think it's trillions of dollars of productivity lost because of this. And it's a real problem. When you made the point, security teams have been trying to argue we're not just a cost center. We are someday going to enable the business because we're going to prevent a cybersecurity incident and we're going to keep the company running when it would have otherwise been down. And now there is a direct linkage where they can say, at many companies that have never experienced a large-scale cyber attack, your tooling cost more downtime than a cyber event ever did. Why am I investing in any of you? Why do we even have a cybersecurity department? These are going to be really tough questions because the empirical data is bad for making that argument. now. It is really bad. And because there's this example. And I think this is why CrowdStrike is going to have trouble holding on to customers, because I think once boards and other C-suite members do climb off the ledge, I think a minimum they will ask is, we can't be with these guys anymore. We need at least something to change, because this can never, ever happen again, and we've lost trust in them. If we're going to continue to have a cybersecurity program, we need to put even greater emphasis on continuity of the business. And if that means less effective controls, less security overall, in with the trade-off of ensuring business continuity, then we will do that. So this will have a negative impact, I think, on cybersecurity teams in terms of their funding, their mandate, their ability to affect change. All of this will be impacted by it, because now they're on the wrong side of the ledger for so many organizations. I mean, short of like an MGM Hotels that did have a cybersecurity incident where it felt like this, most organizations will say, cyber never did this. We never had an event that did this, and your tooling did. So it's hugely problematic. I think cooler heads will prevail over time, but I think you will see a lot of negative impacts in the short term as we get past this. I mean, I'm keeping in mind that there's a lot of people who are still going to go to work tomorrow morning. We record this again Sunday night, that are still going to be working on this for probably the broader part of the week, if not at least the first few weekdays. So this is still a developing situation, but yeah, it's I'm not trying to be doom and gloom here, but you just think about it from a business person's perspective, and that's how they're going to come.
So what has Microsoft been doing in this whole crisis? There were a lot of questions about kernel level access, because the file extension that was this content update was a .sys file, and .sys files are often associated with kernel drivers.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been some arguments back and forth that this isn't a kernel driver, it is a kernel driver, so on and so forth. But either way, the question came up in multiple Twitter conversations and other conversations that I've seen is, why can't Microsoft just block this type of access in that a third-party AV vendor can have? And the question is that the answer really is that we could, but our chief of communications tweeted something out today, Frank Shaw with Microsoft, and he said that legally we can't do that the same way that Apple did, because Apple has blocked system kernel extensions now. And, that was obviously painful for a lot of software developers who had programs that use kernel extensions. But Microsoft can't do that because there was an understanding that was reached with the European Commission following a complaint. And so the understanding was that Microsoft agreed to give makers of security software the same level of access to Windows that Microsoft gets. And so that makes sense in the fact that, you don't want to be anti-competitive, but also it opens it up for things like this to possibly happen with third-party vendors.
And before you move on, I want to unpack this point a little more. So for those of you less familiar with the Mac OS side of the world, for the longest time, there were things called kernel extensions on Mac OS. And I would say within the last 5 major releases of Mac OS, I can't remember exactly when, Apple really started to move away from kernel extensions and said, you need to move to this new system extensions model. And they also created a set of APIs that endpoint protection platforms could leverage instead of writing their own effectively custom code. And it was more, we're all going to leverage the same APIs moving forward. You can differentiate in certain ways, maybe more on your detections. But as far as how you access and interact with the system, Apple said, we'll handle that. And so, especially from the Apple crowd, there's been questions of, why has this not happened on Windows? And Andy just answered the question for you. Microsoft legally cannot, because has an agreement with regulators in the European Commission to not do this. And there's other examples throughout the history of Windows. There were AV drivers where Microsoft tried to do broad APIs for them, and the vendors did the same thing, went to regulators. And so this has formed a whole sub conversation on Twitter, which if you're interested in, you should go check out, where folks like Lina Khan of the Federal Trade Commission here in the United States have said, see, this is why we need more regulation, is stuff like this CrowdStrike event. And then people have said, well, actually, Lina, there already is regulation, and that in some ways led to the cause of this overregulation. And it's an interesting conversation to have right now, as regulators, especially in the European Union, have come down really hard on technology companies. And there's been some concern that as the result of regulation, we will have diminished security, diminished functionality, weaker implementations because of the need to comply with regulation. Apple has made this argument vehemently with some of the regulation coming down as a result of the Digital Markets Act in the European Union, that it is making iOS worse because they have to open up things they don't want to open up for legitimate security concerns, as a couple of examples. So there's a broader conversation here, and certainly way beyond the scope of this show. But if you're interested in conversing about the impact on regulation and the tech industry, and maybe some of the negative impacts that can come from it, this conversation is another interesting data point in that conversation. So if you're interested, the corner of Twitter to go check out. Folks like Florian Mueller out of, he covered a lot of the Activision, Blizzard Activision acquisition by Microsoft, but he covers a lot of regulation as well and is a really good follow, as one example.
So Microsoft published a blog that also talked about all the things that they were doing, and this was earlier in July 20th, yesterday. So yesterday morning, that they were, Microsoft was engaging with CrowdStrike to automate the work, which we now know they published a blog just recently, and Adam mentioned it early on in the show, where there's an automated recovery tool that you can just write to a USB, plug it in, boot it up into the USB, and it does the work for you. They're also, Microsoft deployed a couple hundred Microsoft engineers and experts to work directly with customers to help restore them, working with other cloud providers and stakeholders, including Google Cloud Platform and Amazon Web Services, to share awareness. Microsoft posted some manual remediation documents and scripts. And then I thought this was also really cool. CrowdStrike helped Microsoft develop a scalable solution that will help Microsoft Azure infrastructure accelerate a fix for CrowdStrike's faulty update. And they've both worked with AWS and GCP to collaborate on that as well. The blog also said, and this again is a really interesting number, that about 8.5 million Windows devices were affected, which is actually less than 1% of the total Windows devices in the world. And so while that percentage is really small, Adam talked about it, is that the use of CrowdStrike by enterprises is actually, especially in the critical services, is very high. The number of devices was small, but CrowdStrike has many of the Fortune 500 companies, and those companies run many of our critical services, like airlines, hospitals, banks. And so when there's an issue, it seems a lot bigger than maybe just the sheer number of devices that were affected. So all in all, I think, Adam mentioned it in the beginning. I'll say it again. I'm really proud of our employer that they really, banded together and they were working with CrowdStrike to really help the customers. None of the internal conversations that I was a part of was like, hey, let's go try to sell them something. It was really all about like, what can we do to help our customers in this moment? Let's get everything up and running. Let's get support engaged and figure out what we can do.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes there's the perception that that's the first place our minds would go. And it just it's not the case. I can tell you, certainly was not to have a sales opportunity or, let them burn, let them flap in the breeze. And it looks worse and worse for them, which, could set up sales for us over time. That was not a thought either. This is something where we as an industry need to respond together to and swiftly to get our world back up and running. And Andy, as you talked about some of that collaboration, multiple times you said GCP and AWS and collaborating with them on best approach as well. So I think really proves, like I've always said, cybersecurity is a team sport, and that rising tide lifts all the ships. And in crisis is sometimes our moment of triumph. I'm very proud of how we as an industry have come together to post hilarious memes on Twitter, but also to help get things up and running again. It's been awesome to see the collaboration. And, just like I'm going to mangle this reference, but there's a story about when Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers from the television show, was young. Whenever he would see like a catastrophe on television, Mr. Rogers' mother always said, look for the helpers, look for the people helping. No matter what happens, there will always be people helping. And that's what we saw here. We saw people helping. And that is in an episode that in some ways can be a downer. That is the uplifting part, is everyone is chipped in various ways to try to help. And that's
so another really good conversation to have is around the level of access that really AV products and solutions have. They have root level access, they have kernel level access. And is this a good idea? Should a vendor be able to change one of their kernel level drivers or content update, whatever you want to call it? Jake Williams actually put it very distinct in his one tweet, which was, we know, and here's the technical breakdown. We know that it's not exactly an update. We know it's not a kernel driver, but it was a file with a .sys extension. It was sitting inside of the Windows/System32/drivers directory, and that file prevented a kernel driver from functioning correctly. So basically a distinction without any difference. So for the sake of argument, we'll just call it a kernel driver.
Mm-hmm.
Should these type of security solutions have that level of access? And Kevin Beaumont, who has often been critical of Microsoft, he actually took our side on this one and talked about how there have been many mitigations that Microsoft has tried to make, but endpoint protection platform vendors have worked around them all the time, including CrowdStrike. Microsoft has tried to make this space safer. We talked about that, but then vendors like McAfee pushed back against it many years ago. The status quo right now is to trust your AV and EDR vendor 100%. Their QA, their security, and in this case, if they screw up their QA, then your business goes down. And so I think, well, Kevin thinks at least that Microsoft should be empowered to go back and make some guardrails so that security vendors can operate securely. Maybe somewhere in the lines of like Apple, where they publish APIs. That has been mentioned quite a bit, like publish APIs so that everyone's on the same page. But of course, like it's very tough because Microsoft still has a lot more share than Apple does. It's not just like, Microsoft has obviously a lot more of the enterprise share for Windows than just Apple OS. And then we run servers as well. So I think it's a really interesting conversation. Kevin mentions it, is that the status quo sucks. It's not great. It's not 100% acceptable, but it's a problem that we've kind of created from cybersecurity, because as cybersecurity professionals promote, that we need to have root level access, that we need to have global admin, that we need to have keys to the kingdom in order to protect the things. And then when we screw it up, that this is what happens. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I do think that it is something that needs to be in discussion. Should we 100% trust a security tool when they have the power to do this? Interesting enough, one of the reasons when Adam and I have conversations with customers to talk about the differences between CrowdStrike and Defender for Endpoint, one of the things is command level access on the back end for administrators. CrowdStrike allows full command line into using their tool, but Microsoft does not. And oftentimes I have customers ask me, why not? Like, why can't I do all the things in command line that I would be able to do as an admin? And the reason is because Microsoft engineers and product managers have made a conscious decision that they don't want full command line access in an admin portal that could be compromised. So if you have that level of access, then you can essentially wreak havoc across anything that has your security tool in it if you were a malicious person, including a malicious insider. And so I think, again, this is something that security product teams need to look at, security architects at companies need to look at when they're picking out a solution. What is your deployment process for updates? What is your Q&A process? And what are some of the design decisions to help things like that?
A lot in there you just went through for sure. My hope, and agree that the status quo is effectively unsustainable. My hope is that the endpoint protection vendors can get together with Microsoft and everyone can kind of bring their humble pie to the table and come up with a set of APIs and standards that we can all agree to and live with. And we can go to the European Commission and say, we're holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Can we please do this to prevent another incident like this one? And that would be accepted, and Microsoft does this. It is not from lack of engineering talent. As I often tell people, sometimes the fact that Windows works at all is a miracle. With the number of hardware permutations and different combinations of everything and how open of a platform it is, the fact that it works on 1 billion devices worldwide is the most incredible computer science engineering feat of all time. And that comes from somebody who loves the Mac and thinks the Mac has a great place in the world, and Apple has great engineers too. But it's very different to engineer something to run on very specific static sets of hardware that don't come in a bunch of different combinations versus something that can run on trillions of combinations around the world. If everyone came together and said, let's do this, Microsoft could do this. Absolutely, we could deliver on it from an engineering perspective. And so that's my number one hope. I think it's a really good point, Andy, and you kind of walk through this in various ways, that security teams have demanded this unfettered, infinite access to every endpoint in their environment. And with great power comes great responsibility, as we say all the time. And this highlights that great power and how the responsibility can fall short sometimes. And you talked about, hey, I can get into an admin console and I can run arbitrary command line prompts on every machine in my environment. Man, this is sweet. If I'm a bad guy, think of all the damage I could cause, not just to your cloud services, to every single endpoint in your environment. It's quite incredible to think about. So there is that double-edged sword of, with more privilege becomes more opportunity to screw things up. And Andy, you and I often laugh sometimes when customers will come to us and be looking at, say, our mobile protection tooling, Defender for Endpoint for, say, iOS or Android, and they'll come with a laundry list of all the things they can do on a Windows PC and say, I want to do all that. And we just kind of laugh and be like, not happening. iOS does not afford that level of access. Android doesn't afford that level of access. And neither system is there the concept of this like system kernel level access that can see and do everything on the machine. And they're safer for it. They're better for it. So it again goes back to that conversation I had early on during this show, where I talked about the cure can't be worse than the disease. And I think in many ways we have gotten so far over our skis on that, and gotten that equation out of whack. So I think there will be some right sizing there as well, over time, and finding the right place for it. Because I also talked about, let's assume there will be bad code pushes again from another vendor in the future. I don't remember this, but a lot of folks have talked about how McAfee had an incident in 2010 and took down tons of Windows XP machines with a bad update to their antivirus solution at the time. And so here we are 15 years later, having apparently not really learned our lesson or something. I don't know. But it goes to the point of we need to build in resilience against bad code. Bad code will happen. Do we slow down these deployments? We don't need the ability, I do not believe, to push behavioral updates to every machine in the field all at once. I think if you can deliver that in 48 hours, we're doing great. If you can deliver that in 36 hours, we're doing great. This is where defense in depth comes in. Like, we should not be so dependent on our AV EDR solution that we expect it to have these round the clock updates that are so, it turns out, inherently dangerous. We should expect our other security solutions to pick up the slack. We should expect our identity platform to block B, and not so reliant that EDR has to be all things all the time. And I have seen that a lot of security professionals still are over rotated on EDR being the end all be all. And I see it as more a puzzle piece in the broader puzzle. And maybe if we get to that point of thinking about it, then we become less demanding of, I need all of these updates all the time right now. I can allow a little bit of a delay because I will pick it up somewhere else. And that trade-off is worth it because it exponentially reduces my risk of a global failure event like this one. So there's a lot of conversation, I think, yet to come on the future of these solutions. And like we talked about with the impact to cybersecurity departments inside of enterprises around the world, there are tough conversations ahead. There will be, because we're on the wrong side of the ledger right now in terms of productivity saved versus productivity lost. And it's going to take us a long time to get back on the good side again, especially when we have a hard time proving we prevented an attack in a lot of cases, because if we do our job, nothing happens. And then we just look like a cost center. So one closing thought here. It's random how I was listening to a podcast that was recorded prior to this incident. And one of the hosts was trying to be a little provocative, but he said, I'm pro, and my ears perked up. I'm like, pro ransomware? What are you talking about? He said, ransomware increases the cost of cybersecurity incidents, justify the investment in security, which makes computing better for everyone. So I don't want companies to get hit with ransomware attacks, but when they do, it shows there's a cost to not investing in cybersecurity. Well, that now sounds quaint in the aftermath of this, where so many organizations had much bigger impact than ransomware has ever cost them, unless you're a company like a Maersk or an MGM Resorts. So it's so interesting because it feels like we're at step one of a really broad journey that is going to dramatically impact our business moving forward. And Andy, I'm excited to unpack that with you as we go along, because I think we are on the verge of some pretty big changes coming to our industry as a whole, and look forward to following those stories with you and for our viewers.
One final item of discussion that I wanted to talk about is any long-term lessons from this. And I think we've talked about a few, but one of the things I do want to highlight is that even though this wasn't exactly a cybersecurity incident, it definitely was an operational incident that took down your company in the same way that any cybersecurity attack would have. And so one of the things that I have talked about, Adam has talked about, what we've talked about on the show, I've talked about on other podcasts, is you need to have an incident response plan. That is very basic. You need to have a what happens when the world is burning and my systems don't work. Do you have a way to communicate? Do you have a way to do backup business? Right? Like, what's your fallback situation? And your fallback situation has to be planned for a time period that may be exceeding to what you might even dream of. Like, for example, the ransomware incidents that hit the hospitals a couple months ago, we talked about that. And, they were using paper charts, paper notes for months. Their plan, I think, talking to someone I was talking to someone who's in the medical field in IT, and, he was saying that his he asked the same question to his organization, and they're like, yeah, we have a 72-hour plan. And it's like, okay, well, what happens after 72 hours? Like, like what happens if it's like a month, like what's happening now? So you need to have an incident response plan. And if you didn't, and this was something that you had to respond to, you should have documented all the pain points of what happened and what you could and could not do, and put that into a plan. I couldn't, talk to anybody on Teams, or I couldn't, recover BitLocker keys because they're on a server that went down, right? So one of the things that, from Twitter is move those BitLocker keys to Entra. When you move them to the cloud, you're able to access those BitLocker keys even if your server is going down. So and then also lapse, right? Having administrative access, make sure that you have lapse enabled, which again you can do now in Entra and Intune. There's cloud lapse. Have those lapse passwords in the cloud, so that way you can provide those passwords, over the phone to a user who might need to run administrative access to, take care of something like this. Yeah, so there was a few lessons. I think those were probably the biggest ones for me. Anything else come to mind, Adam?
Some like staged rollouts within your company, so to where you can take updates and spread them out a little bit. If your EDR platform does this, you should definitely enable it. As we've learned from here, I think it's very clear at this point that the cost benefit's worth it. It's a trade-off to maybe have a little bit of delay in picking those up, in terms of having confidence it's not going to take everything down. So I know our solution does it. I can't speak to others like Palo Alto, Cisco, SentinelOne, but check with your vendor, see if they do. Obviously, I think at this point, no one should be taking updates and deploying them to your whole enterprise in a single shot. So, and again, I think we'll learn more. I think there were some failures to how that's supposed to work. I'm fingers crossed for radical transparency from CrowdStrike on that. But if you're not on CrowdStrike and you're on another vendor, definitely something you want to turn on. I think that's a lesson learned for sure, is make sure you're not all taking the same antivirus updates or behavior updates or anything else all at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if there is a way to turn that on within your EDR platform, for sure. And those deployment rings should already be something that you're doing, because you should probably have those for Windows Update for Business. So if you're doing what Microsoft deems as best practice for just Windows updates, then those deployment rings of people or machines should already be there. You can use those same rings for your security updates. And again, like Adam said, Defender for Endpoint, Microsoft's solution, has a way to do this natively within the solution. Hopefully, whatever EDR platform
Andy,
you're using
maybe
also
you don't
has
want
that
to use your Windows
ability,
Update rings because you want it to be faster.
Stand that up.
But in the case, like, look at this incident. What if you just had 6 hours of delay? That would be enough. Yep. That would have been enough to protect you. I'm not saying you need to like build in weeks ahead of time. You could literally build in a couple of hours and you'd hear the screaming, or you'd see the mushroom cloud coming from other orgs, and you could abort before it hit you. So you don't need to introduce massive delays, but any delay, if I could go back in a DeLorean to Thursday afternoon and tell a CrowdStrike customer, hey, delay taking updates for 6 hours, trust me, that would have been enough to help them, I think, in a lot of cases. So just something to think about, I think, and definitely implement if you haven't already. This highlights the need for it.
All right. What an episode. This was fun to go through. And again, our thoughts go out to all the support folks. Adam mentioned, he's worked in enterprise IT. I've worked in enterprise IT. I definitely understand, the stress that folks are under and getting everything up and running. So hopefully you guys are up and running by next week, and this will just be a blip on the radar. But this was really great to go through. I'm going to have a ton of links and references in the show notes, so definitely check those out. And our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.